Good evening and welcome to this session where the spotlight is on trade barriers. Mr. Dhawal Shah, Director of Metco India, will give a presentation titled Trade Barriers, Are They Rising or Receding?, offering an update on the key developments and measures being used by nations to protect their metal and scrap industries. Mr. Dhawal is currently serving as Senior Vice President of the BIR Nonferrous Board and as Vice President Nonferrous at Material Recycling Association of India. He is a recognized expert in the recycling business and a highly regarded conference speaker. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Dhawal.
Hello, friends. First, I must congratulate the organizers for conceptualizing this International Recycling Week, which covers discussion on every aspect of our industry, including touching upon some of the intricate issues. The topic given to me today was to talk about trade barriers, if they are increasing or receding. Now, at the outset, what I'd like to say is that this subject has too many things at its core. It's just not a topic confined to international business, but it also hinges around several hot issues like trade protectionism, geopolitics, environment, regional accords, discords, licensing, IPR, subsidies, labor programs, so on and so forth. Somewhere you will find that for every country, it's an issue of trade policies blended with their foreign policy, but now harnessing more of economic nationalism. Now, before I move into the sphere of trade barriers in our business, I think it's important to take some pages out of some bigger, broader international events. You see, history would tell you that for about 50 years, there was a general trend across the world towards trade liberalization. Tariffs on goods fell steadily. The average global tariff was about close to 8.5–9% in the early 90s, and it fell to about 2.5% in 2017. But since middle of 2018, this trend began to reverse, in particularly involving bilateral trade relationship between two of the world's biggest economies, that is the US and China. The situation only precipitated through 2019. Most analysts claim that an intense trade war was the biggest risk to world growth. Now, despite all the firewalls created in the form of tariff-based and non-tariff-based barriers on goods and services from both sides, the trade surplus which China has over US is still over $300 billion. I think with Europe, with the EU, China has a surplus of about close to $140–150 billion, which again is a huge number. You see, one can argue that trade deficits are not inherently bad for economies if there are limited resources for a particular country in terms of manpower, in terms of technology, goods and services. So it's typical that you reach out to another country and establish trade relations. However, the rising consumption and the trade quantum itself does trigger an alarm when business starts looking highly imbalanced or lopsided, when it starts encroaching your own domestic manufacturing. I believe that through their treasury buys, China currently holds about close to 15% of the total US debt amongst all the countries. So it does shackle the minds and one starts creating barriers in order to hold off further penetration. Now, in addition, these barriers also and the counter-retaliatory measures, they hold off new investments. Here, I would like to give you an example of India. You see, post-independence, we remained largely an agricultural economy until the 80s. The Indian manufacturing and the service sector started to evolve after that. But what we have seen over the last a decade or so is that our manufacturing sector has remained stagnated at about close to 16–17% contributor to the GDP. The service sector has exponentially grown. But if you consider an average GDP growth of 6–6.5% over this period, the manufacturing index should have proportionately grown. But the fact remains that our capacity utilization is only at about 67–68%, and new jobs are difficult to come by in this sector. Now, in the middle of all this, India remained obligated to liberalize its foreign trade, create regional partnerships. So FTAs were supposed to bring a paradigm shift towards this. Between 2004 and 2014, we signed about 11 preferential free trade agreements, the most prominent ones being with the ASEAN countries, the 11 Southeast Asian countries that we have, excluding China. Now, an overview would tell you that our trade deficit with the ASEAN has increased from 8 billion in 2008-9 to about 22 billion in 2018 and 19. Now, there have been no new agreements signed over the last 7 years. In fact, we received a lot of flack for pulling out last minute from our discussions under RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which also included China. You see, at this point in time, even with the ASEAN, if you leave aside countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, we already have a trade deficit with most of the other member countries. Even without the RCEP or any trade agreement with China, our deficit is about close to $45 billion. And any further partnership would have only dented our manufacturing sector further. You see, the genesis of all this lies in the fact that post the financial crisis, global trade had shrunk as countries tried hard to get back on growth trajectory. They have been optimizing policies which give them an advantage, a home advantage over others. Unfortunately, we've had the pandemic now, and after the financial crisis, this has or will become the tipping point for overhauling of trade policies to avoid economic pitfalls. So my overall view is that while globalization shall continue, it may have undertones or overtones of protectionism, which in other words means that it would possibly bring an end to this open trade era, which in other words means that there could be more trade barriers. The G7, they endorsed the Build Back Better theme. It certainly gives hope to integrate the like-minded developed and developing nations to checkmate any authoritarian controls. However, it is important that the end objective of such theme or such program is balanced, fair growth for all the countries that are involved. So the intricacies will have to ensure that they create such a program where everybody gets benefited and it is sustainable. Now, moving on to the trade side, you see, I'm particularly involved with the secondary non-ferrous sector. Over the last 6 months, I have attended numerous meetings between governments, associations, trade, direct, indirect, all stakeholders. The one big thing that has resonated from all of these meetings is free trade. Now, when I say free trade, it is meant for scrap metals, for scrap materials, which is our raw material input, our only raw material input. Material that is collected, sorted, segregated, processed through cutting, shearing, shredding, baling, briquetting, then sold to consumers, smelters or foundries, who in turn make products, and then it is being consumed by, let's say, category A applications like automotive, steel, high-tech engineering, packaging, construction, aeronautics. The entire process, I believe, has a very deep positive impact on environment, sustainability, preservation, employment, and international business. Shedding all rhetorics, I'm convinced that when I say that this is the best shining example of resource efficiency and circular economy. You could include green production and decarbonization as well in that. Now, despite all its inept goodness, the international trade is getting more and more difficult. You see, what lies at heart of the problem is the different interpretation or perception of how lawmakers see our business and what the trade is actually doing. The lawmakers want to paint everything with one brush, perhaps often combining it with our raw materials with waste. The trade is pushing extremely hard to differentiate and tell them that this is not waste, this is our raw material. You see, China was or is one of the biggest importers of scrap. So they were the first ones to push for a new set of rules for international scrap business, which redefined quality, packing norms, inspection procedures, and so on and so forth. This is still work in progress as new classification for imports are being worked out for every category. Now, being the largest consumer of scrap, it created one of the biggest disruptions in our history, in the history of international scrap business. Similar talks are going on in Malaysia and India to create a new import framework, forming new standards or classifications, which possibly would create more impediments to our business. Under the aegis of the Green Deal, EU is proposing to introduce new norms, which could again see restricted movement of scraps out of Europe. So such trade barriers have and would defeat all discussions on circular economy, sustainability, and decarbonization. Today in India, we levy an import tax of about between 2.5 to 5% and freely allow value-added downstream products to come into the country at zero duty under the FTAs. Now, this is totally absurd, regressive in my opinion, as we are freely allowing substitution of products either through imports or with primary metals, which has a significantly higher carbon footprint and which is economically not viable. So this happens at the cost of pushing our own manufacturing, the secondary manufacturing, to the wall. Net, somehow I feel that our organized international trade of recyclables or scrap is slowly becoming a victim of overzealous lawmakers who still identify our materials, our raw materials, with some plastic removed from the ocean or what they see on the street, whereas our situation is not that. So as trade, we holistically and fundamentally accept that our free trade does not entitle us for free movement of any polluting or hazardous material, but every attempt should also be made to allow free trade of good quality processed raw materials or scraps, which help us to mitigate socio-economic and environmental problems. Now, any such barriers, including levying of taxes, should be done away with. On that note, I'd like to say goodbye to all of you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much.